The hull groaned under my feet, and I knew we had less than 10 minutes left to live. My name is Vay Solran, second officer of the coalition cruiser Embervale, and on that day I stopped believing that the Void cared whether we lived or died. Our shields were down to 11%. 3 of our 4 engines had gone silent. Behind us, the Skarn raiders closed in formation, their dark ships cutting through the dark like teeth closing around a throat. I gripped the edge of my console because my hands would not stop shaking. Around me, the bridge crew worked in total silence, the kind of silence that comes when everyone already knows the outcome and is only delaying it out of habit. Captain Doneth stood at the center of the bridge, his eyes fixed on the forward display, watching the Skarn ships grow larger with every passing second. We were not soldiers by trade. The Embervale was an escort vessel, built to guide colony transports through quiet space, not to fight a war. Behind us, 3 slow-moving transports carried almost 6,000 civilians, families who had left their home system because the soil there had turned to dust and the rivers had stopped flowing. They believed they were sailing toward a new beginning. Instead, they had sailed into the path of the Skarn. The Skarn did not negotiate. They did not take prisoners for ransom or trade. They came for resources, for ships, for anything that could be stripped down and sold in their hidden markets. The people aboard those transports were nothing more to them than parts waiting to be removed. "Distance to the lead raider," Captain Doneth said, his voice flat, controlled, the voice of a man holding himself together by sheer will. 200,000 kilometers and closing, I answered. At their current speed, weapons range in 6 minutes. He nodded once, the kind of nod that meant he had already made peace with what was coming. I had served under Captain Doneth for 4 years. I had never seen him afraid until that moment, and somehow his fear frightened me more than the Skarn ships did. "Comms," he said. "Send the distress signal again. Full strength, every frequency we have." "Captain, we already sent it 11 times, said Rena, our communications officer, her voice tight. "No one has answered. No one is close enough to answer." "Send it again," he said. "If this is the last thing we do, let it be that we tried." Rena's fingers moved across her console, and I watched the signal indicator pulse outward across the display, a single thin line racing into the emptiness of space, carrying our location, our situation, and a request for help that I did not believe anyone would ever receive. I had grown up hearing stories about the great alliances of the galaxy, the powerful fleets that patrolled distant borders, the heroic rescues that filled our history books. None of those stories ever mentioned a moment like this one, where help was needed and there was simply no one near enough to give it. Out here, on the edge of charted space, we were alone, truly, completely alone. The nearest Allied fleet was 4 days away at full speed. The nearest patrol station was even farther. We had miscalculated our route to save fuel, cutting through a corridor that intelligence reports called quiet. The reports had been wrong. By the time the Skarn ships appeared on our sensors, it was already too late to outrun them. "Engine 3 is failing," called out Thomas, our engineer, his voice rising in pitch. "I can't keep it stable, Captain. We're losing power across the aft section." "Reroute everything to shields," Captain Doneth ordered. "We need to protect the transports as long as we can." I turned back to my display and watched the numbers fall. Our shields, already weak, would not survive contact with even a single Skarn weapon volley, let alone the coordinated assault of an entire raiding pack. I thought of the families aboard those transports, the children who had been born during the long journey, the elders who had given up everything they owned to find a safer world. I thought about how none of them knew, in that exact moment, how close their new beginning was to ending before it had even started. "Captain," Rena said suddenly, her voice catching, "I'm picking up something odd in the long-range scan." "Define odd," Captain Doneth said. "A single contact, far out. It wasn't there 30 seconds ago." I leaned over my console, pulling up the same data she had. A faint dot had appeared at the very edge of our sensor range, moving in a way that made no sense. Ships did not simply appear from nothing. They had to decelerate from faster-than-light travel, and that process always left a detectable trail, a signature that built up over time. This contact had no trail. It was simply there, as if it had stepped out of a door that the rest of us could not see. "Could be a sensor glitch," Thomas offered, though he did not sound convinced. "It's not a glitch," Rena said. "It's holding steady. Whatever it is, it's real." Captain Doneth straightened, his eyes narrowing at the display. "Identify it." "I'm trying," Rena said, her hands flying across her console. "The hull signature doesn't match anything in our database. It's not Skarn. It's not Coalition. It's not anything I recognize." I felt something strange stir in my chest, a small and fragile thing that I almost did not recognize because it had been absent for so long during this crisis. It was hope, and I was almost afraid to let myself feel it, because hope that turns out to be false hurts far more than no hope at all. "Captain, the Skarn have noticed it too," I said, watching their formation shift slightly on my display. "They're adjusting course, just slightly, as if they're uncertain." That detail struck me more than anything else. The Skarn were not a hesitant people. Their raiding parties moved with brutal confidence, certain that nothing in this region of space could threaten them. For them to alter course at all, even slightly, meant that whatever had just appeared on our sensors was something even they did not want to ignore. "Time until that new contact reaches our position?" Captain Doneth asked. Rena ran the calculation twice before answering, as if she did not trust her own numbers. "If it maintains its current speed, less than 2 minutes." 2 minutes, Thomas repeated, almost laughing, though there was no humor in the sound. "The Skarn will be in weapons range before that." "Then we hold," Captain Doneth said. "We hold as long as we can." I looked at the dot on my screen, this single unidentified presence racing toward us out of the deep black, and I tried to imagine what kind of vessel could move that fast, appear that suddenly, and unsettle even the Skarn without firing a single shot. Whatever it was, it did not behave like anything I had ever studied in my training. It did not behave like a rescue ship sent in answer to a distress call, slow and cautious, requesting clearance before approaching a combat zone. It moved like something that had already decided what it was going to do and did not feel the need to ask permission from anyone. "Captain," I said quietly, "I don't think that ship is afraid of the Skarn." He did not answer me. He simply stared at the display, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on that single growing dot, and for the first time since the Skarn had appeared on our sensors, I saw something other than resignation on his face. I saw the faintest trace of disbelief, the look of a man watching the impossible become real right in front of him. The Skarn lead ship fired its first warning shot, a streak of energy that crossed in front of our bow and vanished into the dark, a clear message that our time for waiting had ended. The bridge lights flickered as our shields absorbed the shockwave from the near miss. Alarms began sounding across every console. "Brace for impact," Captain Doneth said, his voice steady despite everything. I gripped my console and closed my eyes for half a second, preparing myself for what I believed would be the end. When I opened them again, the unidentified contact had grown large enough on our sensors to register its true size, and what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. It was massive, far larger than anything we had expected from a single approaching vessel. Its hull was dark, angular, covered in plating that looked thick enough to withstand direct fire without flinching. There were no decorative markings, no elegant curves designed to project peaceful intentions. Every line of that ship spoke a single purpose, built without apology, without softness, without any attempt to look harmless. "Identification confirmed," Rena said, her voice trembling slightly. "The hull markings match a registry pattern I've only seen in old archive files. Captain, that's a human vessel." The word hung in the air of the bridge, like something none of us quite knew how to process. I had read about humans during my training, the way every coalition officer eventually did. They were a young species, recently introduced into the wider galactic community, generally regarded as competent but cautious, more interested in trade agreements and scientific exchange than in projecting military strength across distant regions of space. Their territory was considered remote, their response to outside conflicts slow, careful, weighed down by layers of internal debate before any action was ever taken. No one expected a human ship out here, in this forgotten corridor, arriving within minutes of a single distress call. "That can't be right," Thomas said. "Their territory is nowhere near here. There's no way they responded that fast." "I'm not questioning the data," Rena said. "I'm just telling you what it says." Captain Doneth straightened his uniform, a small, almost unconscious gesture, the kind a person makes when they are trying to regain control over a situation that has slipped entirely out of their hands. He stared at the approaching vessel, and for a long moment, none of us spoke. The Skarn ships, which only seconds earlier had been closing in on us with total confidence, began to slow. I watched their formation tighten, their weapons systems shifting target priority, no longer focused solely on the Embervale and our transports. They were reacting to the newcomer, recalculating, recognizing a threat that had not existed in their plans only moments before. "They're hesitating," I said. "Captain, the Skarn are actually hesitating." "Let them hesitate," he said quietly. "We need every second we can get." The human ship continued its approach, cutting through the space between us and the raiders, with a speed that defied everything I understood about standard combat doctrine. There was no caution in its movement, no attempt to assess the situation from a safe distance before committing to action. It moved the way a thrown weapon moves, fast, direct, with absolute certainty about where it was going to land. I had spent my entire career believing that no help would ever come for ships like ours, stationed at the edges of known space, far from the protection of larger fleets. I had accepted, somewhere deep in my mind, that crews like mine simply accepted the risk of being forgotten when something went wrong. That belief had shaped how I approached every mission, every patrol, every quiet moment on the bridge when I let myself think about what would happen if disaster ever found us this far from home. In that moment, watching a single human warship cut through the void toward an enemy fleet that had been seconds away from ending everything I cared about, I felt that belief begin to crack apart, piece by piece, faster than I could process the change. "Captain," Rena said, her voice barely above a whisper, "they're hailing us." Captain Doneth looked at me, then at the display, then back at the small flashing icon that indicated an incoming transmission from a ship none of us had expected to ever see, let alone hear from, in the final minutes of what we had believed was certainly our last battle. "Open the channel," he said. The bridge fell completely silent, and in that silence, I realized that whatever happened next was going to change everything I thought I understood about who we could count on, and who we could not, in the vast and unforgiving dark between the stars. The voice that came through our speakers was calm, in a way that felt almost out of place given everything happening around us. There was no urgency in it, no panic, no formal greeting filled with diplomatic phrases. It sounded like a person checking in on a situation they already expected to handle. "This is Captain Owen Hale of the UNS Falconer," the voice said. "I'm reading your distress call. Looks like you're having a rough day out here." I glanced at Captain Doneth, uncertain how to respond to something so casual in the middle of what felt like our final moments. He seemed equally caught off guard, his mouth opening slightly before he found his words. "Captain Hale, this is Captain Doneth of the coalition cruiser Embervale. We are escorting 3 civilian transports carrying approximately 6,000 refugees. We are under attack by Skarn raiders and our defenses are critically low. We did not expect any response to our signal, especially not this quickly." There was a brief pause before Hale answered, and when he did, there was something almost amused in his tone, though not unkind. "Yeah, I figured you didn't. Don't worry about the how right now. Just tell me your current status. Hull integrity, shield strength, weapons capability. I need numbers, not feelings." I admired the directness of the request, even as my mind raced to understand how a single ship could have arrived so quickly across such a vast distance. Captain Doneth nodded toward me, and I quickly pulled up our diagnostic readings. "Shields at 9% and falling," I reported. "Engine 3 offline, Engine 4 operating at reduced capacity. Weapons systems functional, but limited to short-range defensive fire. We cannot survive sustained contact with the Skarn formation." "Copy that," Hale said. "Here's what's going to happen. I want you to pull your ship and those transports back, as far as your remaining engines will allow, away from the Skarn position. Don't engage, don't try to help, just create distance. Can you do that?" "Yes, Captain," Doneth said, "but you are facing an entire raiding pack alone. There are at least 8 Skarn vessels in that formation." "I counted 9, actually," Hale replied, his tone unchanged, as if the number meant nothing to him. "But thanks for confirming." I stared at the display, trying to process what I had just heard. 9 Skarn raiders, each one capable of overwhelming a ship like ours within minutes, and this single human captain spoke about them the way someone might mention a minor inconvenience during an otherwise ordinary day. "Captain Hale," Doneth said carefully, "I do not believe you understand the threat level you are facing. The Skarn do not retreat. They will not show restraint because you arrived. I strongly recommend requesting additional support before engaging." There was a short pause, and when Hale spoke again, there was a faint trace of something in his voice that I could not quite identify at the time, though later I would understand it as simple confidence, earned through experience rather than arrogance. "Appreciate the concern, Captain, but additional support isn't coming. Not in time to matter for your people back there. It's just me, right now, and that's going to have to be enough. Pull your ships back. I've got this handled." The channel closed before Doneth could respond, leaving the bridge in stunned silence once more. I looked at the display, watching the Falconer continue its approach toward the Skarn formation. No hesitation in its trajectory. No indication that the pilot aboard that vessel had any doubts about what was about to happen. "Helm," Captain Doneth said, his voice regaining its composure. "Bring us about. Begin retreat pattern, minimum safe distance from the Skarn position. Signal the transports to follow our heading." "Captain, are we really just going to leave him out there?" Thomas asked, disbelief evident in his voice. "We are following his instructions," Doneth said. "He gave us a clear order, and frankly, I do not see another option that keeps our people alive. If he believes he can hold that line, then our responsibility is to get the transports to safety while he does." I understood the logic of the decision, but something inside me resisted the idea of simply turning away while a single ship faced down an entire raiding pack on our behalf. I had spent my whole life believing that no one came to help ships like ours, and now that someone had, the idea of abandoning him to face the consequences alone felt deeply wrong, even if staying meant nothing more than watching helplessly from a safer distance. "Rena, keep that channel open," I said. "I want to monitor everything that happens." She nodded, her fingers already working to maintain the connection as our cruiser began its slow turn away from the battlefield. Through the forward display, I watched the Falconer close the remaining distance toward the Skarn formation, its size becoming even more apparent as it drew nearer to the enemy ships, dwarfing several of the smaller Skarn raiders despite being a single vessel facing an entire pack. The Skarn ships had reorganized themselves into a defensive formation, no longer focused on our retreating transports, but fully oriented toward this unexpected threat. Their weapon systems charged, visible even from our distance as faint points of gathering energy along their hulls. "They're going to fire on him from multiple angles," Thomas said, watching the same display I was. "No ship can withstand that kind of concentrated assault, no matter how heavily armored it looks." I did not respond, because I genuinely did not know whether he was right. Everything about the way the Falconer moved suggested a level of confidence that made no logical sense given the numbers involved, and yet that confidence had been consistent from the very first moment Captain Hale spoke to us. Either he knew something about his ship's capabilities that we did not understand, or he was about to make a fatal miscalculation in front of all of us. "Picking up another transmission," Rena said suddenly. "It's not directed at us. I think it's an open broadcast. He wants us to hear it." "Play it," Doneth said. Hale's voice filled the bridge once more, though this time his tone had shifted slightly. Sharper, more focused, the voice of someone fully committing to the task in front of him rather than casually managing a conversation. "Skarn formation, this is Captain Owen Hale of the UNS Falconer. You are currently engaged in an unprovoked assault against a civilian convoy under coalition protection. I am requesting that you disengage immediately and withdraw from this system." There was no response from the Skarn, only the continued charging of their weapons systems, visible across our sensors as their formation tightened further. "I'll take that as a no," Hale said, his voice almost light again, though there was an edge beneath it now that had not been there before. For the record, I did ask nicely. "What is he doing?" Thomas muttered. "Why would he warn them at all? Why give them the chance to prepare?" I did not have an answer for him, but watching the events unfold, I began to suspect that the warning had not been intended for the Skarn at all. It had been intended for us, a message broadcast openly so that we, the witnesses, would understand exactly what was about to happen and why, a record established before the engagement began, as if Hale wanted there to be no question later about who had been given the chance to walk away. The Skarn fired first. A coordinated volley erupted from multiple points across their formation, streaks of weapons fire converging toward the Falconer from at least 6 different directions simultaneously, an attack pattern clearly designed to overwhelm any single target regardless of its defenses. I watched the display, my chest tightening, certain that I was about to witness the destruction of the only ship that had come to help us. The Falconer's shields flared bright as the combined assault struck its hull, a brilliant burst of light visible even across the distance separating our 2 vessels. For a terrible moment, I believed the ship had been destroyed outright, the light too intense, too overwhelming for any vessel to have survived. Then the light faded, and the Falconer was still there, still intact, still moving, its trajectory barely altered by the impact it had just absorbed. "Shields holding," Rena reported, her voice filled with disbelief as she read the data streaming across our sensors. "Captain, his shields only dropped to 83% from that entire volley." I stared at the number, trying to reconcile it with what I had just witnessed. A coordinated strike from 9 Skarn vessels, an attack that should have crippled or destroyed most ships in our fleet several times over, and the Falconer had barely registered the impact. "That should not be possible," Donath said quietly, echoing my own thoughts. "Their shield technology should not be capable of absorbing that much sustained energy." "Maybe their shield technology isn't the only thing we don't understand about them," I said, watching as the Falconer's own weapons began to charge in response, gathering points of light along its hull that made the Skarn weapons look small and insignificant by comparison. "Captain," Rena said, "he's opening a new channel. This one is directed at us again." "Put it through." Hale's voice returned, steady, almost conversational, as if he were simply continuing a conversation that had paused momentarily, rather than someone who had just survived a coordinated assault from an entire raiding fleet. "Sorry about that interruption," he said. "Just wanted to confirm your transports are clear of the immediate area before things get a bit more intense out here." "Captain Hale," Donath said, struggling to find the right words, "your shields absorbed that entire attack with minimal damage. How is that possible?" "Standard hull rating for this class," Hale replied simply, as if the answer required no further explanation. "We build our ships to take a hit, several hits actually, before we even start worrying. I know that probably looks unusual from where you're sitting, but it's pretty standard for us." I exchanged a glance with Captain Donath, both of us recognizing the same realization settling over the bridge at the same moment. Everything we believed about humanity, their caution, their slow response times, their reluctance to project military strength across distant regions of space, had been built on assumptions that were proving wildly inaccurate in the span of just a few short minutes. "Your transport's clear?" Hale asked again. "Yes, Captain," Donath confirmed. "We are maintaining safe distance as instructed." "Good," Hale said. "Then sit back and let me handle the rest. This shouldn't take long." The channel closed once more, and I watched as the Falconer's weapons reached full charge, the gathered energy along its hull pulsing with a kind of restrained power that made the earlier display from the Skarn formation look almost insignificant by comparison. Whatever doubts I had carried about this single ship's ability to face down an entire raiding pack were beginning to fade, replaced by something I had not expected to feel during what I had believed only minutes earlier would be the final moments of my life. I felt, for the first time since the Skarn had appeared on our sensors, something close to genuine hope. I had read every report the Coalition archives held on humanity, every analysis written by trade envoys and cultural attachés who had visited their worlds over the past several decades. Every single one of those reports described a species defined by caution. Humans were said to debate among themselves before taking any significant action, slowed by internal political structures that required agreement among many different groups before a single ship could be committed to a conflict outside their own territory. They were considered allies in name, present at coalition meetings, contributing to trade agreements, but never truly tested in matters of open conflict. No one expected much from them in a crisis, and over time, that expectation had simply become accepted fact among the other species of the Alliance. Watching the falconer hold its position against 9 Skarn raiders without a flicker of hesitation, I began to understand how badly that accepted fact had failed to capture the truth. "Captain," Rena said, her eyes fixed on her display, "the Skarn are repositioning. They're spreading out, trying to surround him." I watched the same pattern unfold on my own screen. The 9 raiders breaking from their earlier tight formation and fanning outward, clearly attempting to force the falconer into a position where it could not defend against attacks from every direction at once. It was a reasonable tactic against most single vessels, a way of overwhelming a target through sheer numbers and angles, removing any advantage that armor or shielding might otherwise provide. "He's letting them do it," Thomas said, disbelief evident in his voice. "Why isn't he moving to counter that formation?" I did not have an answer, and neither, it seemed, did Captain Donath, who stood at the center of the bridge with his arms folded, watching the unfolding situation with an expression I could only describe as cautious wonder. The Skarn completed their repositioning, forming a wide circle around the falconer, each raider now positioned to fire from a different angle, a tactic clearly designed to prevent any single defensive maneuver from protecting against all of them at once. I braced myself for what I assumed would be a devastating coordinated assault, the kind that even the falconer's impressive shields might struggle to withstand a second time. Instead, the falconer moved. It happened faster than I expected, the massive vessel accelerating directly toward the nearest Skarn raider rather than attempting to retreat or find a defensive position equidistant from the surrounding formation. The maneuver seemed almost reckless, closing the distance with a single enemy ship while leaving itself exposed to fire from the remaining 8 vessels positioned around it. "What is he doing?" Donath murmured. "That puts him directly in the crossfire of the entire formation." I watched, my breath caught in my chest, as the falconer closed the distance to the nearest Skarn ship with startling speed. The remaining raiders opened fire immediately, their combined weapons converging on the falconer's position from multiple directions, exactly as their formation had been designed to allow. But something strange happened as the weapon's fire reached its target. Several of the shots that should have struck the falconer directly instead struck the very Skarn ship it had positioned itself beside, the raiders' own allies inadvertently firing on their comrade in their attempt to hit a target that had placed itself too close to be safely targeted without risking friendly losses. "He used their own ship as cover," I said, understanding dawning slowly as I watched the tactic play out. "He moved in close enough that they can't fire on him without risking hitting each other." "That's insane," Thomas said, though there was something almost admiring in his tone now, the earlier disbelief shifting into something closer to fascination. "No standard combat doctrine would recommend a maneuver like that." "Maybe their doctrine isn't standard," I said, watching as the falconer's weapons fired directly into the Skarn ship it had positioned itself beside, the raiders' shields collapsing under the concentrated assault before its hull began to break apart entirely. 1 raider down, 8 remaining. The Skarn formation scattered in response, clearly recognizing that their initial tactic had failed catastrophically, several ships breaking away from their positions to avoid the same fate that had just befallen their companion. The falconer did not pursue any single target, instead continuing its aggressive forward momentum, weapons cycling rapidly as it engaged multiple raiders in quick succession, never lingering in one position long enough for the remaining Skarn ships to coordinate an effective counterattack. "Captain," Rena said, "he's opening another channel, audio only this time, no video." "Put it through," Donath said. Hale's voice came through again, slightly strained now, the effort of combat evident beneath his still controlled tone. "Sorry, this might get a little loud on my end for a bit. Wanted to check in and confirm your transports are still clear." "They are, Captain," Donath answered. "Your tactics are unlike anything in our combat manuals. May I ask how you trained for this kind of engagement?" There was a brief pause, filled with the faint sound of distant impacts on the other end of the channel, before Hale answered. "Honestly, most of what you're seeing isn't textbook stuff, it's adaptation. You learn pretty quickly that the other side's formation is only as strong as their willingness to risk hitting their own people. Most raiders, pirates, that sort of crew, they don't have the discipline to hold formation once things get messy. They start worrying about themselves instead of the group." "And if they had maintained discipline?" I asked, unable to stop myself from joining the conversation. "Then I'd have used a different approach," Hale said simply. "There's always a different approach. You just have to be willing to take a hit while you figure out which one works." I considered his words carefully, recognizing in them a philosophy entirely different from anything I had been trained to understand. Coalition doctrine emphasized caution above all else, careful calculation before any engagement, retreat as the preferred option whenever the odds appeared unfavorable. Hale's approach seemed to operate on an entirely different principle, one that accepted damage and risk as simply part of the process rather than something to be avoided at almost any cost. "Captain Hale," Doneth said, "your shields took significant damage during the initial volley. How much longer can your ship sustain this level of engagement?" "Long enough," Hale said, his tone carrying a confidence that I was beginning to understand was not arrogance but simple, practiced certainty. "This isn't my first time dealing with a raiding pack. Probably won't be my last either." The channel went quiet again as the Falconer continued its assault, weaving between the remaining Skarn ships with a precision that made the larger vessel look almost nimble despite its size. I watched 2 more raiders fall in quick succession, their hulls breaking apart under concentrated fire as the Falconer pressed its advantage, never giving the remaining Skarn ships enough time to regroup into an effective counter formation. "6 remaining," Rena reported, tracking the engagement on her console. "Captain, the Skarn are starting to break formation entirely. I think they're considering retreat." I felt a flicker of something close to relief at her words, though I forced myself to remain cautious, aware that the Skarn had a reputation for desperate, unpredictable behavior when cornered, sometimes more dangerous in retreat than in their initial assault, willing to take reckless actions if it meant escaping with even partial success. "Captain," I said, "if the Skarn retreat, will Captain Hale allow them to leave, or will he pursue?" Doneth did not answer immediately, his attention fixed on the unfolding battle, watching as another Skarn ship attempted to break away from the engagement entirely, only for the Falconer to intercept its path with a speed that should not have been possible for a vessel of its size. "I don't think he intends to let any of them leave," Doneth said quietly. I watched the intercepted Skarn ship attempt evasive maneuvers, twisting away from the Falconer's pursuit, only for a precise weapons strike to disable its engines entirely, leaving it drifting helplessly in space while the Falconer moved on toward its remaining targets without slowing down. "He's not destroying that one," I said, noticing the difference in the Falconer's tactic. "He disabled it instead." "Captain Hale," Rena said, opening the channel again on her own initiative, "you left one of the Skarn ships intact. May I ask why?" Hale's voice returned, slightly out of breath now, though still steady. "Figured your coalition authorities might want someone to question about who sent this raiding party out here in the first place. Skarn don't usually operate this far from their territory without a reason. Might be worth finding out what that reason is." I had not considered that possibility, too caught up in the immediate crisis to think beyond simple survival, but Hale's words carried a kind of forward thinking that struck me as remarkably practical, planning for consequences beyond the immediate engagement even while still actively fighting for his life and ours. "That is a wise consideration, Captain," Doneth said. "We will ensure the appropriate authorities are notified." "Appreciated," Hale said. "Now if you'll excuse me, I've still got 5 more of these to deal with." The channel closed again, and I returned my attention to the main display, watching as the remaining Skarn ships attempted increasingly desperate maneuvers to either escape the engagement or find some way to turn the tide back in their favor. None of their attempts succeeded. The Falconer continued its relentless, methodical assault, weapons cycling with a precision that suggested an experienced crew operating in perfect coordination, each strike calculated to maximize damage while minimizing the ship's own exposure. 5 remaining, Rena updated, her voice steadier now, the earlier disbelief replaced by something closer to quiet awe as she watched the battle continue to unfold in humanity's favor. 4. "Captain, he just took down 2 in the same maneuver." I watched the display, witnessing the Falconer execute a tight turn that brought its weapons to bear on 2 Skarn ships simultaneously. Both raiders caught in the same firing arc as the larger vessel pivoted through the battlefield with a grace that contradicted everything about its heavily armored, aggressive design. The 2 raiders' shields collapsed within seconds of each other, their hulls beginning to fracture under the combined assault. 3 remaining, Thomas said, his earlier skepticism completely gone now, replaced by something that sounded almost like enthusiasm. Captain, I don't think the Skarn have ever faced anything like this before. I found myself agreeing silently, watching as the remaining 3 Skarn ships finally broke into full retreat, abandoning any pretense of coordinated tactics in favor of simply trying to escape the engagement entirely. The Falconer pursued briefly, disabling another raider's engines in a maneuver similar to its earlier tactic, before allowing the final 2 ships to flee into the depths of space rather than continuing the pursuit. He let the last 2 go, I said, watching the retreating Skarn signatures fade from our sensors. Captain, Rena said, incoming transmission from the Falconer. Put it through. Hale's voice returned once more, noticeably more relaxed now, the strain that had been present during the height of the engagement largely gone from his tone. Engagement complete. 7 Skarn vessels destroyed or disabled, 2 retreated. I'm reading minor damage on my end. Nothing critical. How are your transports holding up? They are intact, Captain, Doneth answered, his voice carrying a tone of genuine gratitude that I had not heard from him since the crisis began. Thanks to your intervention, all 6,000 civilians aboard those transports remain safe. Glad to hear it, Hale said simply, as if confirming the safety of 6,000 lives was a small, unremarkable detail rather than the central outcome of an extraordinary battle. I'm going to recover that disabled Skarn ship for questioning, then I'll escort you the rest of the way to your destination, if that works for you. I sat back in my chair, processing everything that had just happened, the speed of his response, the strength of his ship, the calm confidence with which he had approached and resolved a threat that I had genuinely believed would end all of our lives only minutes earlier. Everything I thought I understood about humanity, their caution, their reluctance, their supposedly limited military capability, had been completely upended in the span of a single engagement. That works for us, Captain Hale, Doneth said, and on behalf of everyone aboard the Embervale and the transports under our protection, thank you. We did not expect any help to arrive in time. We certainly did not expect this. There was a brief pause before Hale responded, his tone carrying a note of something quieter, more sincere than the casual confidence he had displayed throughout the engagement. That's exactly why I came as fast as I did. Figured no one else was going to make it out here in time. Glad I was wrong about being too late. I looked at the display, watching the massive shape of the Falconer drift between the wreckage of the Skarn formation it had just dismantled almost single-handedly, and I felt the last remnants of my earlier despair give way to something entirely new, a growing sense that the galaxy I thought I understood was far stranger and far more hopeful than I had ever allowed myself to believe. The relief on the bridge lasted only a few short minutes before Rena's console began flashing with a new alert, and the brief calm that had settled over us shattered just as quickly as it had arrived. Captain, she said, her voice tightening again, I'm picking up a transmission from the disabled Skarn vessel. It's not directed at us. It's outbound, heading deeper into Skarn territory. Captain Doneth moved quickly to her station. Can you intercept it? Determine its content? I'm working on it, she said, her fingers moving rapidly across her console. It's encrypted, but the transmission pattern matches something in our archives. Captain, this looks like a distress call, the same kind raiding parties send when they need reinforcement. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. They're calling for backup. Worse than that, Rena said, pulling up additional data. Based on the signal strength and the direction it's traveling, there's a Skarn outpost roughly 6 hours away by their standard travel speed. If that outpost responds, we could be facing a much larger force before we ever reach safe territory. I opened a channel to the Falconer immediately, unwilling to wait for Captain Doneth to issue the order himself, given the urgency of the situation. Captain Hale, we have a problem. The disabled Skarn vessel sent an outbound distress signal before you disabled its engines. It appears to be calling for reinforcements from a nearby outpost. There was a brief pause before Hale responded, his tone shifting immediately from relaxed to focused. How long ago was that signal sent? Unknown precisely, Rena answered, joining the channel directly. Based on the transmission pattern, possibly during the early stages of the engagement, before you disabled the ship completely. That gives them a head start, Hale said, more to himself than to us. The the sound of rapid movement audible through the channel, as he apparently shifted his attention to new data on his own systems. If there's an outpost within 6 hours, we need to assume they're already mobilizing a response. "What are our options, Captain?" Donath asked, having joined the conversation now as well, his earlier relief replaced once more by the same tense alertness that had defined the earlier crisis. "Options are limited," Hale said. "Your transports can't outrun a fresh Skarn response force, not with your current engine damage. We need another solution." I watched the display, trying to think through the problem alongside the others, aware that whatever decision was made in the next few minutes would determine whether the danger we had just survived was truly behind us, or simply the opening stage of something far larger. "Captain Hale," I said, an idea forming even as I spoke, "if the outpost intercepted that distress signal, they will be expecting to find their raiding party engaged with a damaged coalition escort and helpless transports. They will not be expecting to find you." There was a pause on the channel, and I could almost picture Hale considering the implication of what I had just said. "You're suggesting we use that against them," he said slowly. "Let them walk into a situation they think they understand, and surprise them with one they don't." "It is a risk," Donath said cautiously, "but our transports cannot reach safe territory before a larger force arrives regardless of what we do. If we must face them eventually, facing them on terms we have some control over seems preferable to facing them unprepared." "I like the thinking," Hale said, "but there's a problem with timing. Your transports still need to get clear of this area, regardless of what happens with any second wave. I can't protect them and set up an ambush at the same time, not without splitting my attention in ways that could get someone killed." The bridge fell quiet as everyone considered the problem, and I found myself thinking back to everything I had witnessed during the previous engagement, the way Hale had used the Skarn's own formation against them, the way he had thought several steps beyond the immediate moment even while actively fighting for his ship's survival. "Captain," I said, "what if the transports continued ahead at their best possible speed, while the Embervale remained behind with you? Our cruiser is damaged, but we still have functioning weapons and sensors. We could serve as additional eyes, relay information, perhaps even provide limited support during the engagement." "Vey," Donath said, surprise evident in his voice, "our ship is barely holding together as it is. Engaging a second Skarn force, even in a support role, carries significant risk." "I understand the risk, Captain," I said, "but if we simply flee while Captain Hale faces a second wave alone, after everything he has already sacrificed to protect us, I do not believe that is a choice I can live with, regardless of the danger involved." I heard Hale exhale slowly through the channel, the sound carrying a kind of quiet consideration before he spoke again. "I appreciate the offer, Lieutenant, truly, but my priority remains getting those transports to safety. That was the entire point of responding to your distress call in the first place. If you want to help, the best way to do that is to make sure those 6,000 people reach their destination, not by putting yourselves in further danger on my account." I wanted to argue further, but something in his tone told me that his decision was already final. The same calm certainty that had defined every choice he made throughout the engagement now applied just as firmly to this new situation. "Understood, Captain," Donath said, accepting the decision with a kind of reluctant respect. "What would you have us do instead?" "Get your transports moving immediately. Best possible speed toward your original destination," Hale said. "I'll stay behind with the disabled Skarn vessel and prepare for whatever response that outpost sends. If I can convince them that nothing unusual happened here, maybe they won't pursue at all. If they do pursue, I'll handle it the same way I handled the first wave." "Alone," I said quietly, unable to keep the concern from my voice. "Wouldn't be the first time," Hale said, and though his tone remained steady, I thought I detected something underneath it, not fear exactly, but a kind of weary acceptance of the role he had chosen for himself, the role of standing between danger and the people who could not protect themselves. The Embervale and the 3 transports began moving away from the battlefield at our best possible speed, our damaged engines straining to provide whatever acceleration they could manage. I remained at my station, monitoring the Falconer's position on our sensors for as long as our equipment allowed, watching the massive ship hold its position near the disabled Skarn vessel, alone against whatever was coming. 3 hours into our retreat, Rena's console flagged a new contact entering the system, moving along the same trajectory the earlier distress signal had been sent toward. My chest tightened as I watched the data populate across the display. "Captain," she said, "new contacts detected. I'm reading at least 15 vessels, possibly more, approaching from the direction of the Skarn outpost. 15 ships, nearly double the size of the first raiding party that had nearly destroyed us, now converging on a single human vessel that had chosen to remain behind rather than abandon a damaged escort and its precious cargo to an uncertain fate. We need to turn back," I said immediately, the words leaving me before I had fully considered them. "Captain, we cannot simply leave him to face that alone." "Vey," Doneth said, his voice carrying both sympathy and firm authority. "Our orders were clear. Captain Hale specifically instructed us to continue towards safety. Turning back now would not only disobey his direct request, it would place these transports and everyone aboard them back into danger for a battle our damaged ship could not meaningfully influence." I knew he was right, even as every instinct told me to do otherwise. I forced myself to remain at my station, watching the sensor data update with each passing minute, the distance between our retreating convoy and the unfolding situation behind us growing larger with every kilometer, even as my concern for the single ship and crew who had saved our lives only hours earlier grew correspondingly heavier. "Captain," Rena said, her voice tight, "I'm losing detailed sensor contact with the engagement. We're too far now to track specifics, only general activity in that region of space." "Keep monitoring whatever you can," Doneth said, "and keep that channel open in case Captain Hale attempts contact." The hours that followed were among the longest of my life. I remained at my station long past the end of my standard shift, unable to bring myself to leave the bridge while uncertainty hung over the fate of the ship and crew who had given us back our lives. The bridge crew worked in near silence, each of us processing the same uncomfortable awareness that somewhere behind us, a single human vessel was facing odds that should have been impossible to overcome, and we had no way of knowing whether our earlier rescue had simply delayed an inevitable tragedy rather than preventing one entirely. Nearly 5 hours after losing detailed sensor contact, Rena's console suddenly flared with new activity, and she sat up sharply in her chair. "Captain, I'm picking up a transmission. It's the Falconer's signature, Captain Hale's identification codes. The connection is weak, but it's definitely him." "Put it through," Doneth said immediately, his earlier composure giving way to obvious urgency. The channel crackled with static before Hale's voice came through, tired but unmistakably alive, carrying a faint edge of strain that had not been present during our earlier conversations. "This is Captain Hale of the UNS Falconer, reporting status to the Embervale. Engagement with the 2nd Skarn force is complete. We took some damage, more than the first round, but the ship held together. Outpost force has retreated, scattered after losing roughly half their numbers." I felt a wave of relief so powerful that I had to grip the edge of my console to steady myself, the tension that had built throughout the previous hours finally beginning to release from my chest. "Captain Hale," Doneth said, his voice thick with genuine emotion, "we are relieved beyond words to hear your voice. What is your current condition?" "We've had better days," Hale admitted, a faint trace of dry humor returning to his tone despite the obvious exhaustion underneath it. "Lost partial power in 2 sections, some structural damage along the lower hull, but nothing critical. Crew is shaken but uninjured. We'll need repairs before we can travel at full speed, but we're stable for now. Do you require assistance?" Doneth asked. "We can turn back immediately." "Negative," Hale said firmly. "Continue toward your destination. I'll make my own way back to friendly territory once repairs are sufficient for travel. Your priority remains getting those civilians safely to where they're going. That hasn't changed." I wanted to protest again, the same instinct from hours earlier rising once more, the desire to do something more than simply continue on, while the person who had saved us managed his own recovery alone, far from any support. But I understood now, in a way I had not fully grasped before, that this was simply who Captain Hale was, someone who gave everything required of a situation without expecting anything offered in return, someone for whom the safety of others took priority over his own comfort or recognition. "Captain," I said quietly, "thank you." For everything. I do not believe words are sufficient for what you have done for us today." There was a brief pause before Hale answered, his voice softer now, carrying none of the earlier strain. "Just doing the job, Lieutenant. Glad I made it in time. Now get those people home safe. That's the part that matters most." The channel closed, and I sat back in my chair, staring at the display where the faint signature of the Falconer remained visible at the edge of our sensor range. A single ship, badly damaged but still standing, having faced down two separate waves of overwhelming odds without ever once requesting that we abandon our own path to safety on his account. I thought about everything I had believed about humanity before that day, the caution, the slowness, the supposed reluctance to commit to conflicts beyond their own borders. None of it matched what I had witnessed. What I had witnessed instead was something far rarer, a willingness to face impossible odds without hesitation, paired with a quiet humility that asked for nothing in return. I did not yet fully understand what that meant for the future of our alliance with humanity, but I understood, with absolute certainty, that everything I thought I knew about them had been wrong. 4 days later, the Embervole and its 3 transports reached Meridian Station, the colony outpost that had been our destination since the very beginning of this long and difficult journey. I stood at the observation deck as the transports docked one by one, watching families step out into a place that, only days earlier, I had believed they would never reach. Children ran across the docking bay floor, laughing in a way that none of them had during the tense final hours of our voyage, and elders embraced station workers who had come out to welcome them, tears visible on faces that had carried only exhaustion and fear during the worst of the crisis. Captain Donath stood beside me, watching the same scene, his expression carrying a quiet satisfaction that I had rarely seen from him during our years of service together. 6,000, he said softly. Every single one of them made it. Because of him, I said, my eyes drifting toward the docking bay's external display, where a secondary feed showed the slow approach of the Falconer, finally arriving after several additional days spent completing emergency repairs in the system where the second engagement had taken place. Word of what had happened had already spread well beyond our small convoy by the time we reached Meridian Station. Captain Donath's official report, transmitted ahead of our arrival, had reached Coalition Command within hours, and from there, the story seemed to travel faster than any of us anticipated. By the time the Falconer docked at the station 3 days after our own arrival, a crowd had gathered to witness its approach, Coalition officials, station administrators, and ordinary residents alike, all drawn by accounts of a single human warship that had single-handedly turned back not one, but 2 separate Skarn assault forces. I made my way to the docking bay alongside Captain Donath, both of us eager to formally meet the crew who had saved our lives, though I suspected my own reasons carried more personal weight than simple official protocol. The Falconer's hull, visible now up close for the first time, bore the marks of the battles it had endured, scorched plating along its lower sections, makeshift patches covering damage that had clearly been repaired with whatever materials were available rather than proper station equipment. Despite the damage, the ship still carried an unmistakable air of quiet strength, the same impression I had formed during our first encounter, only reinforced now by clear evidence of what it had survived. Captain Hale emerged from the docking corridor a short while later, accompanied by a small contingent of his crew. He was younger than I had expected, though something in his bearing suggested experience well beyond his apparent years, a kind of settled confidence that did not need to announce itself loudly to be noticed. He looked tired, the strain of the previous days visible in the lines around his eyes, but he carried himself with the same calm steadiness that had defined every transmission during the crisis. "Captain Donath," he said, extending a hand in greeting as we approached. "Good to see your transports made it safely." "Captain Hale," Donath replied, accepting the gesture with evident warmth. "The gratitude of everyone aboard those transports, and everyone aboard the Embervale, cannot be adequately expressed in words. You saved 6,000 lives, and you did so without hesitation, without any expectation of recognition or reward." Hale shrugged slightly, a small, almost embarrassed gesture that contrasted sharply with the decisive confidence he had displayed throughout the entire engagement. I responded to a distress call. "That's the job. Wasn't looking for recognition." Be that as it may, Doneth said, the Coalition Council has already requested a formal meeting to discuss what happened here, and to extend appropriate recognition for your actions. I suspect this story will travel far beyond Meridian Station before long. I stepped forward then, unable to hold back any longer the question that had been sitting with me since our very first contact with the Falconer. Captain Hale, may I ask you something directly? He turned his attention toward me, his expression open, curious. Of course, Lieutenant. How did you arrive so quickly? I asked. Our distress signal should have taken far longer to reach any vessel capable of responding, let alone a vessel capable of arriving within minutes. Every report I have ever read about humanity describes a cautious approach to matters beyond your own territory, careful deliberation before any significant action. None of that matched what we witnessed. Hale considered the question for a long moment before answering, and when he did, his tone carried a kind of thoughtful honesty that suggested he had given this same question some consideration himself. Most of what gets written about us in other species reports focuses on our diplomatic behavior, trade negotiations, formal alliance discussions. That side of things does move slowly. Lots of voices, lots of agreement needed before official action happens. But this was different, I said. This was different, he agreed. Distress calls work differently than diplomatic decisions. Any vessel within response range that has the capability to help is expected to act immediately, without waiting for permission from higher authority. That's not a recent policy. It goes back a long way in our history, further back than most people outside our territory probably realize. We learned a long time ago what happens when help arrives too late, or doesn't arrive at all. We decided as a people that we would rather be the kind of presence that shows up, even when no one expects us to, even when the odds look bad, rather than wait for perfect conditions that might never come. I thought about his words carefully, recognizing in them a kind of cultural philosophy that none of the formal reports I had studied had ever captured. The image of humanity I had carried throughout my career, cautious, deliberate, slow to commit, had been built entirely on observations of their diplomatic behavior, while an entirely different aspect of their character, one defined by immediate, decisive action in moments of genuine crisis, had remained largely invisible to outside observers simply because so few crises had ever placed that aspect on display. Your ship, Doneth said, gesturing toward the Falconer's battle-worn hull. Its design seems built specifically for this kind of engagement. Heavy armor, powerful weapons systems, all on a vessel that responds to distress calls rather than serving purely as a warship in a standing fleet. Most of our long-range response vessels are built this way, Hale said. When you're going to be operating alone, far from support, against threats you can't predict in advance, you build for worst-case scenarios. Better to have more capability than you need than to arrive somewhere and discover you brought the wrong tool for the job. I found myself struck by the simple practicality of his explanation, a design philosophy born not from aggression, but from a deep understanding of the isolation that comes with operating far from immediate support, the same isolation I had felt so acutely during the worst moments of our own crisis. Over the following days, as repairs continued on both the Falconer and the Embervale, I spent considerable time speaking with members of Hale's crew, learning more about the culture and history that had shaped the kind of response we had witnessed. I heard stories about humanity's own difficult history, conflicts among themselves that had taught hard lessons about the cost of hesitation, about waiting too long to act when action was needed most. I began to understand that the confidence I had witnessed during the engagement was not simply individual bravado, but the product of a broader cultural commitment instilled across generations to never again be the reason help arrived too late. The Coalition Council's formal meeting took place a week after our arrival at Meridian Station, and I was asked to attend as a witness alongside Captain Doneth, given my direct involvement in monitoring the engagement from the Embervale's bridge. The council chamber was filled with representatives from a dozen different member species, all eager to hear first-hand accounts of an event that had already become the subject of widespread discussion throughout Coalition space. I described what I had witnessed as accurately as I could: the speed of the Falconer's arrival, the tactics employed during the engagement, the calm confidence that had characterized every interaction with Captain Hale throughout the crisis. I watched the reactions of the assembled representatives as I spoke, surprise evident on many faces, particularly among those whose own species had long held similar assumptions about humanity's military caution. This account suggests a significant gap between our understanding of human capability and the reality of that capability, one representative said, addressing the council. If a single vessel was capable of this level of effectiveness against a substantial raiding force, we may need to reconsider our broader assumptions about humanity's role within our alliance. I listened to the ensuing discussion with a strange mixture of feelings, pride in what Captain Hale and his crew had accomplished, but also a quiet discomfort at hearing his actions reduced to strategic calculations about alliance value and military assessment. I thought about his own words during our conversation, the simple explanation he had offered for his actions, a culture built around the belief that someone should always show up when help is needed, regardless of the odds, regardless of recognition. That motivation seemed far removed from the kind of strategic calculation now being discussed in the council chamber. After the meeting concluded, I sought out Captain Hale one final time before his ship completed its repairs and prepared to depart. I found him on the observation deck overlooking the docking bay, watching the slow, steady work of repair crews moving across his ship's damaged hull. The council meeting did not go quite how I expected, I told him, settling beside the railing. A great deal of discussion about strategic implications, alliance value, military capability assessments. Hale gave a small, knowing smile, the kind of expression that suggested this was not the first time he had encountered this particular reaction. That tends to happen. People hear about something like this, and the first instinct is to figure out what it means for them, strategically. Makes sense, I suppose. Everyone's trying to understand a piece of the galaxy they didn't fully understand before. Does that bother you? I asked. Having your actions discussed in those terms, rather than simply as what they were. He considered the question for a moment before answering. Not really. People can think about it however makes sense to them. Doesn't change what actually happened, or why it happened. I responded to a distress call because that's what we do. The strategic implications, the council discussions, all of that is just what happens after, once other people start trying to make sense of it. I found his perspective remarkably grounded, especially given everything I had witnessed him accomplish during the crisis. There was no need in him to control the narrative surrounding his actions, no desire to ensure that others understood his motivations in exactly the way he intended. He had done what he believed needed to be done, and the meaning others attached to that action afterward was simply not his concern. I want you to know, I said, that regardless of how the council chooses to interpret what happened, I will always understand it the way you described it to me. As someone who showed up because no one else could, because that was simply who you chose to be. Hale looked at me for a long moment, something gentle in his expression. That means more than you probably realize, Lieutenant. Thank you for that. The Falconer departed Meridian Station 3 days later, repairs sufficiently complete to allow for safe travel back toward human territory. I stood at the same observation deck where I had first watched it dock, watching now as it pulled away, its damaged hull still bearing the marks of the battles it had survived, but its trajectory steady and certain as it moved toward the deep black of open space. I thought about everything that had changed in the days since our distress call had first gone out into the void, certain that no one would answer. I thought about the assumptions I had carried for my entire career, the belief that ships like ours, stationed at the edges of known space, simply accepted the risk of being forgotten when disaster struck. I thought about how thoroughly that belief had been overturned, not through grand diplomatic gestures or formal alliance announcements, but through the simple, decisive actions of a single ship and its crew, who had arrived without fanfare, fought without hesitation, and departed without ever asking for anything in return. I did not know, standing there watching the Falconer shrink into the distance, exactly how this event would reshape the broader relationship between humanity and the rest of the coalition. I did not know how many council meetings would follow, how many strategic assessments would be written, how many other species would begin quietly revising their own understanding of what humanity was truly capable of when the moment demanded it. What I did know, with absolute certainty, was that I would never again assume that help was not coming. I would never again accept, as simple, unavoidable fact, that distant ships facing impossible odds were destined to face them alone. Somewhere out there, across the vast and largely unmapped distances of human territory, there were other ships like the Falconer, Other crews like Hales, ready to answer a call that no one expected them to hear, ready to arrive when arrival seemed impossible, simply because that was who they had chosen to be. No aid was expected that day, out at the edge of known space, where 6,000 lives hung in the balance, and an entire crew had quietly made peace with an ending none of us wanted. And then, from the depths of the void, where nothing should have been close enough to hear us, a single warship answered anyway. I have carried that lesson with me ever since, through every mission, every quiet moment on a bridge far from home, every distress signal sent out into the dark with no certainty that anyone is listening. Somewhere, someone might be listening after all. Somewhere, someone might already be on their way.